As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group of 5 urban explorers approached the decaying asylum. Its iron gates loomed like a rusted warning, the darkness inside a promise of forgotten horrors. Their excitement was palpable, fueled by the thrill of uncovering the unknown. Lila, the leader, checked her flashlight and nodded to her friends. They pushed past the gates, their breath clouding in the cool evening air. Alex, the photographer, snapped a picture of the decaying building. Ben was at the rear, eyeing the place with a skeptical frown. Nora, always quiet and observant, lingered behind. Jonah, with his gadgets and tools, was already checking his phone for signal, but there was none. The heavy doors creaked as they pushed inside, their flashlights casting long shadows against the crumbling walls. They wandered deeper, taking in the sights of abandoned medical equipment, rusted gurneys, and peeling paint. The air was thick with dust and the heavy smell of mold, but they pressed on. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the building felt, as if it was alive, breathing with them, waiting. They found the stairs leading down to the basement. The stairs groaned under their weight, and the air grew colder the further they descended. At the bottom, the basement stretched out into an abyss of rusting pipes and damp stone. There were no windows here, only the faint hum of old machinery and the silence that seemed to press down on them. Jonah led the way, scanning his surroundings with eager eyes, though the unease in the air was beginning to grow. They moved cautiously, passing through narrow corridors filled with rusted metal and shattered glass. They reached a narrow door, slightly ajar. It was covered in grime, and something about it seemed off. Jonah pushed it open, revealing a long hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The air was thick with stale, decaying scents, but the group pressed on. The hall was tight, claustrophobic, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they walked. Suddenly, Alex, in his enthusiasm, misjudged his step. The floor beneath him gave way with a sickening crack, and he plunged into the darkness below. His scream echoed up from the pit, a desperate, panicked cry that sent a shock of terror through the group. They rushed to the hole, peering over the edge. Alex's hand reached out from the darkness, blood dripping from his fingers as he clawed at the edges. The others tried to pull him back, but the hole was too wide, and the gap too deep. Without warning, Alex's body twisted violently, his scream cutting off abruptly as something yanked him further into the darkness. Lila, heart-pounding, stood frozen for a moment before she snapped into action. Her voice was a sharp command to the group to move, they had to keep moving . She was the leader, and she couldn't let herself break now. But as they turned to retreat, the hallway behind them had changed. The door they had passed through was now a solid wall, the floor slick with something wet. The walls began to shift, slowly, grinding together as the sound of metal scraping filled the air. Steel bars descended from the ceiling, trapping them in place. Panic set in as they realized they were no longer in control. Ben shoved at the bars, grunting with effort, but the metal refused to budge. The group scrambled for an exit, but the maze of hallways had shifted again, there was no way out. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the hall, figures emerged. They were slow at first, almost mechanical in their movements. Their faces were obscured by grotesque masks made of rusted metal, their bodies clad in old, tattered asylum uniforms. They moved with precision, their eyes blank, cold, and unblinking. There was no sound from them, no words, no warning. Nora was the first to be grabbed. One of the figures lunged at her, its hands like iron, and she was yanked into the air. She screamed as her head slammed into the wall, the sickening crack of her skull echoing through the hallway. Blood spurted from the wound, spraying across the floor, but the figure didn't stop. It dragged her further, using her limp body like a rag doll, before throwing her violently down into the open trapdoor. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Her blood pooled beneath her, staining the floor. Ben tried to fight back. He threw himself at one of the figures, fists flailing, but it was useless. The figure's grip was unyielding. With terrifying speed, it slammed his head into the wall. The sound of cracking bone was unmistakable, and blood poured from his broken skull, staining the walls in a gruesome spray. Ben's body went limp, but they didn't stop there. The figure twisted his body, snapping his back with a forceful jerk. Ben was tossed, lifeless, into the trapdoor next to Nora. Jonah, eyes wide with terror, tried to bolt for the stairs, but his path was blocked. Another figure stepped out of the shadows, its hands reaching out like claws. Jonah shoved against it, but it was stronger, too strong. With a brutal twist, the figure grabbed him by the arm and jerked him toward it. Jonah screamed, but the sound was cut short as the figure dragged him toward the metal bars. A sharp, brutal motion, his arm was wrenched from its socket, the bone snapping like dry wood. Jonah collapsed to the floor, howling in pain. The figure didn't hesitate. It brought down a heavy metal rod onto Jonah's head, the sickening crunch of his skull splitting open, sending a wave of horror through the remaining two. Jonah's body went still, the blood pooling around him, mixing with the dust and debris. Lila and Alex were alone now, both trembling in the corner, their backs against the cold wall. They had nowhere to go. But the figures didn't approach them right away. Instead, they simply watched, their unblinking eyes fixed on the pair. It was as though they were savoring the moment, letting them feel the weight of impending doom. Lila's heart raced. She saw the trapdoor open again, and in the dark depths below, something shifted. She didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The terror of what was happening to her friends had broken her spirit. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't block out the sounds, the sickening thuds, the crunch of bone, the desperate cries for help that would never come. One of the figures reached out toward her, its hand cold and unfeeling. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She let it take her, her body jerking violently as it was pulled towards the open trapdoor. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was Alex, eyes wide in terror, struggling against the inevitability of his fate. The trapdoor slammed shut behind her. Hours later, the asylum stood in cold silence, the faint hum of its decaying machinery the only sound. Outside, the night was still. And Jonah ran. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the rusted gates and out into the open air. His body was bruised, bleeding, but he was alive. He didn't look back. But as he ran, he could feel it, eyes watching him. Cold. Unblinking. The figures from the asylum were still there, always there, even in the darkness. He had escaped, but they were waiting. The last thing Jonah would ever feel would be the weight of their gaze on his back, always following, always watching. They had let him go. They had allowed him to flee. But they were never far behind.